Well, to think of the role you played in helping birth this place, that God used you to bring about Calvary. And to think of the role you played in bringing healing to a very broken place and then advancing it through the 2020 vision.
I think the three of us had tried to approach this role with humility and say, this is the Lord's work, not ours. Calvary can't lose sight of how unusual this is, and it goes back to beyond what we can ask or imagine He's accomplished.
Amen. Cry with joy here to say, there's still people here that believe the same vision that this thing was born out of.
I feel like a silly old man because I cry here when I'm sitting here and somebody gets baptized I know we prayed for, or Brian says something. I think that's so beautiful. So.
People don't realize it, but the original building that we built, a little A-frame, is still standing on Skyline Drive.
We didn't have a great plan for growth. We first began to have a dream that maybe we could do something else.
Things were getting desperate for us. Somebody said, we need to just turn this whole thing over to the Lord. Let Him take us wherever He wants to go. If that means closing the doors and we all go to church someplace else, then that's what we do. Somebody suggested that we contact Larry DeWitt back in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and invite him and his wife to come out here.
I got a call from somebody in California. Would you be interested in coming out and being our pastor? And I kept thinking about it. I said, well, I could go out and consult with him. And I remember sitting at Larry Parks' house, and Becky said to me, would more happen if we came here the next 10 years, more happen for the Lord, or if we stayed where we are? And well, more would happen here. Well, then we're coming.
He loved our dream, and he was well established. He didn't need to come to California to a little dumpy church on the sidelines, and had the gift of faith to help us take those next steps that we needed so desperately.
They knew what they were getting into. Larry's formula for success is unbeatable. Make much of Jesus Christ.
The first week I said, who runs this city? So we spent the first week, we spent an evening with the director of the Chamber of Commerce. I asked him every question I could think about the culture. Where's the center of activity here? There's a restaurant there. He said, that's where all the stuff in town really happens. So what, could we rent that for a church?
Took a lot of turns and changes because we moved out of that original building into a rented facility in a restaurant.
And I think there were people who came to a restaurant on Sunday morning who wouldn't have walked into a Steeple church.
That's right.
The pastor used to say, we have to meet the unsaved on their territory, on their turf, where they're comfortable, not make them come to us. A small town that was experiencing explosive growth, and people were curious about this little church that was meeting in the restaurant. It wasn't long before the little church wasn't a little church anymore.
There was no parking left for his restaurant to open at noon.
And that's when the Lord opened the door for us to transition into the warehouse that's down the street from here.
The idea of a church meeting in a warehouse was almost sacrilegious. I mean, how could anybody do that? But there were people who came there who had never walked into a door of a church.
Worship was great, teaching was great, such a small space for so many people.
The church would hold well over 1,000, but the parking was for maybe 100. You would actually go to church early, because if you didn't, you'd be walking for a while.
Pretty much outgrown the warehouse facilities.
The Lord really was moving in our leadership about a new home for Calvary.
The opportunity came up to acquire this space that we have now.
Hundreds of times we drive by, Lord, that building's going to be ours someday.
We all gathered in the front of the warehouse, Bibles in hand, we had palm branches in hand, we had balloons in hand.
People who were in that parade will never forget it.
That's right.
We'll never forget it.
It was amazing to see us go into that new building, God providing the resources for it, and coming into this gigantic space thinking, what on earth are we ever gonna do? How could we ever fill this place?
We come onto this campus, the ministry begins flourishing, and there's new opportunities for growth and ministries here on our campus, in our community, and around the world. It becomes time for you to hand off the baton to a new pastor and a new leader. We have a new senior pastor who comes in. There are some wonderful things happening in ministry, but in part of Calvary's story is the brokenness of it emerging that senior pastor who came in after you, but before Pastor Sean, had some moral failings and ultimately disqualified himself from the role of senior pastor here.
Our attendance went down 1,000 people in 1 week. You know, we were shaken.
But really the mercy and grace of God on this church is this: people continue to be faithful during that time, sustaining this church through the transition that ultimately led us to the leadership of Pastor Sean Thornton.
The first time Leslie and I were ever at Calvary, I was a guest speaker, had no intention of leaving where I was. I was very content where I was. We got back to the hotel room and we both looked at each other and said, this is a wonderful flock of people and they're hurting and they're hungry. And that's where God began to stir something in me, stirred something in the elders here, that just a couple months later we moved here. I became the senior pastor. And then to watch as those hungry, hurting people were being healed by the Lord over time and through His Word.
Thank God they found a man who was willing to lay his life on the line for a church that was a disaster at that point. Not many people would touch that.
So I first heard of Calvary Community Church, and Drew Walton asked me to be a small group leader with him for high school students, and then became the high school pastor in 2012.
I really believed God would bring another voice. Our elders and others began to see that the Lord might have you be that next leader.
It's very clear that you're God's man to lead this place now. Everybody knows that.
Thank you.
For Larry and me, to call you our pastor is an honor and a joy because you're going to make much of Jesus.
Yeah.
And we know that this vision is centered on Christ and Christ alone.
That's right. What we're walking in right now is really the story of Calvary since the beginning. Every step of the way, there was an opportunity to do what was comfortable, but instead, what Calvary chose to do was what was filled with faith and believing God for immeasurably more. There are people living in this valley who don't know Jesus. There are hurting people who need the help of the gospel and the mercy of Christ. There are people who need this church to be all that it can be so that the gospel can go forth. Calvary has 50 years behind it, but as we go into our next 50 years, we believe that God's not done with this church. He's just getting started. And until Christ returns in glory to judge the living and the dead, we're all in for what God has for this church, for Calvary.
Why shouldn't the next decade be the best yet?
I agree.
Why not?
I agree.